So, you want me to read them? Can a poem save the world? Can little brittle weakling words, even though screechingly sonic, sufficiently aflame a distant human heart to make it act and care, to stop a thunder-capping blast from erupting out a shotgun's ugly muzzle? I enlisted when I was 17. I enlisted in the Marine Corps specifically because I was looking for a guaranteed way to feel that I was a man. So I enlisted right at the height of the Quezon siege. I arrived in I-Corps, so the northernmost portion where the Marine Corps was, in roughly January 8th, 1969. Dewey Canyon was our first operation, and Dewey Canyon as a title of an operation plays again in my life later on when I returned. We went into the northern Ashaw Valley and moved south along with a number of other units, and the military intent of the operation was to force the NVA into the Army at the southern end of the valley. I remember shortly, within a day or two of getting off the helicopters on a hot landing zone, LZ, and beginning to make our way south, coming across a human skull that was just lying there by itself. So that was I remember that very distinctly, just a bit of a wake-up call, that I was in an environment where that was going to be somewhat the norm. But early on in Dewey Canyon, we had come across a wounded NVA soldier, and it was late in the afternoon, and Americans and Vietnamese were trying to get intelligence from him, and they dug his grave right next to him. Never provided him with medical attention. I watched as he was threatened with knives. And that's when my radicalization seeded, that it had never occurred to me that that was part of what Americans do in a war zone. I've never forgotten that. I've told that story a number of times, and I kind of view it as that's my homage to that NVA soldier. Combat is just a horrible, brutal way of being human. And until you're in it, you really can have no understanding of its costs. One of the reasons I came back alive is because I was only in country 7 months. I wasn't wounded, but I was fortunate enough to be with a unit that was the first combat unit introduced into the country. And when Nixon, as part of his de-escalation of the war, pulled out the first American troops, he started with the first units in. And so I was part of that first allotment of 25,000 troops that were taken out of the country. I know that I was progressively weakening mentally and physically. The woman that I was engaged to at the time had kept all of my letters, and I have copies of them, and occasionally, like once a decade, I'll go back and read them in chronological order, and I can see my thought processes just deteriorating. So I truly think that had I stayed there the entire 13 months, I would have done something that would have gotten me killed, because I was just halfway through. It was just obvious to me that my mind was not as strong as it had been. One of the small towns that I lived in was one of the first towns in the U.S. to give a welcome home parade to Vietnam veterans. And I marched in that. I cried the entire way. Um, but the following day, I tried to go back to being normal. Didn't talk to anybody, I mean, all of this pain that was getting generated by this parade, I didn't know what to do with it. I did not have any experience that there was an alternative to that. So much of those middle years were spent in dead ends, still trying to figure out the God issue. But, I burning through marriages and jobs. Now, I was intelligent enough to know that that was a psychological process and that I actually wasn't going crazy. But for a long time, I didn't realize that all of this was part of the post-traumatic stress. And I probably spent the vast majority of my middle years just thinking that I was a failure. I never was able to keep a job. I couldn't stay married. I could never earn much more than just basic income. And I always thought it was me. And I only became aware that those are all fairly classic post-traumatic stress symptoms when I was in my 50s. I don't like reliving Vietnam every day, but because of my wounds, I don't have a choice. Or at least I haven't figured out how not to do it. So maybe I do have a choice and I'm just not taking it. But I hate war, absolutely hate war. And my problem is not hating people who support war or who don't understand how war severely injures every participant. And I guess the reason I have never felt that I've had a career is because that is my career. I have to live out this story, no matter where it takes me. And at this point, it hasn't taken me far beyond the pain. It is a daily struggle to make meaning of life, to feel that I contribute. Yeah. I started really reading a lot on the philosophy of the anti-war movement, and I was working at the Pentagon when Kent State occurred. Almost went to Canada then. Came very, very close to deserting. The final straw for me was when Moore had gone on an alleged fact-finding trip of Vietnam and came back and said that the war was winnable. It just was the first time that I had seen someone with a great deal of power that I knew firsthand did not know what he was talking about. That was comparable to my watching Americans torture a Vietnamese soldier. That it was another myth of America that was just shattered. I filed as a conscientious objector, was doing draft counseling or military counseling, and started figuring out what I needed to do to get out. And after jumping through a number of military hoops, I was discharged as a conscientious objector with an honorable discharge. It was during this period of time that I became a member of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. They were doing a major demonstration in Washington, D.C. at the end of April following their Winter Soldier investigation, which they had held about 6 months before in Detroit. So after Detroit, they came to D.C. and camped on the Mall, were ordered off by the White House, took it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said we had the right to be there. The Washington, D.C. police said, we're not going to throw you off. At the end of that 3-day period was a ceremony where we returned our medals to the government, literally threw them back on the west steps of the Capitol. That was the highlight of my military experience. Making a public stand saying that my government's behavior is unacceptable to me. I still look at that experience as the highlight, second only to the births of my sons. But it was a point where I made a very clear and conscious choice that I was no longer going to believe in the American way of life, because I had found it to be totally untrue. But I write poetry. This started probably about a year or two ago. By and large, it's anti-war. It is at times angry, at times preachy. But I always try to be very clear in the language because I'm trying to convey what being in a war is like, what it leaves people with psychologically. I only write for myself, and I welcome opportunities to read these, but they're difficult to read, they're difficult to hear, and so I don't feel I can push it. It's not entertainment, and so you have to be in a particular mindset to listen. Why do we do it? Well, I do it because if I feel that I could write one more poem tomorrow, then today may be worth it. I'll ask again, like I began, for both your sake and mine. Can little, brittle, weakling words sufficiently inflame a very distant human heart to make it act to halt the shame?